This is a Bloody Vegans production.
So, Claire, Daisy, it would be awesome to get started with a little bit of your journey into the world of veganism. What's kind of brought you here? I don't mind who goes first, whoever fancies taking the reins.
Yeah, so my vegan journey started off a bit later in life. It probably wasn't until I was about 40 that I really started thinking about the food that I was eating. There was a time, I think, when I was about 6 or 7 that it did occur to me, but it was a very fleeting moment. I actually do remember having chicken on my plate for dinner one night and saying to my parents I didn't want to eat it because I suddenly associated that piece of food with the animal, and it was because it was on the bone. I actually remember that quite clearly. But my parents at the time said, no, you've got to eat it, you've got to eat your meat, you won't grow, that sort of... I mean, I don't blame them, they probably didn't know any better, that's what they believed at the time. So I ate it because I'm a bit of a sort of people pleaser. I decided to do what they told me to do. And so I then didn't think about food at all. Again, really, it didn't occur to me what I was eating or didn't make any connections until, as I say, I was about 40. And I watched a vegan documentary called Game Changers, which I think your audience might have already watched. And it was about vegan food in terms of health and exercise performance. And both me and my husband both enjoy exercising a lot. He cycles and I run. And we're by no means professional athletes, but we both do enjoy exercise. And we thought, this is really interesting. All these professional athletes are eating a plant-based diet and they're doing so well on it. Why don't we give it a try, And it was only meant to be for 2 weeks. So we just thought, let's just try it for 2 weeks and see how we feel on it. And so we went plant-based overnight, cut out everything. And after the 2 weeks, we both felt great. We had so much more energy. We felt good in ourselves. We were sleeping better. We were recovering from intense exercise quite well. And I remember saying to my husband, I really love this. I'm going to continue eating this way. I don't want to eat meat. I don't feel like I need it. And luckily he agreed. He felt the same way. So we just continued and didn't think too much of it. We just continued eating plant-based. And then I thought, I am a medical professional. I'm a GP. I should probably look into this a bit more and make sure I'm getting all the nutrients we need as a family. My son was also transitioning. So I started doing some research, and that led me to, really interesting research actually about the benefits of a plant-based diet on our health and how our diets are one of the leading causes of chronic disease. And I found a wealth of evidence surrounding the reduction risk of the big killers in the Western world: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension with a plant-based diet. So rather than being worried about how this would affect my health, I began to realise it would be a very positive thing for my health. And at that time, I also did the University of Winchester plant-based nutrition course. And that's how I found out about the plant-based health professionals, which I then joined. And during that whole time researching about my health, I obviously also saw things that I didn't really think about before. So the environmental aspects of eating a plant-based diet. I learnt a lot about the ethical considerations. I hadn't considered the animals and the plight of the animals that we confine and then slaughter. And so my eyes just opened up really to that side of things. And I thought, gosh, I've always been quite a compassionate person. As a doctor, we go into this profession wanting to help others and compassion and taking the oath not to harm. So why hadn't I ever thought about that, in terms of the animals? And so the compassion then started extended beyond humans to non-human animals. And I'm eventually and did in that transition go vegan for the animals for ethical reasons, not just for my health. But that was a transition. And it involved doing all sorts of things. I went to slaughterhouse vigils, for example. I met people who'd worked in slaughterhouses. So the more I learnt, the more I just became I felt happier that my actions were in line with my moral values. That was a long process from going sort of plant-based overnight to vegan over many months of research. And now I'm particularly interested not just in the nutritional aspects of a plant-based diet, but also the environmental impacts. And as I say, I joined the Plant-Based Health Professionals, which is an organisation that promotes and advocates for a whole food plant-based diet, both for planetary and human health. And I met Clare, and we've now got our own plant-based vegan podcast. So that's my journey in a nutshell. And that's also the name of our podcast as well, in a nutshell.
And how about you, Claire?
Well, so I didn't have quite the same health epiphany because I went vegetarian when I was very young, and it was definitely for the animals, not for the food. I didn't really like vegetables. I remember my parents sort of saying to me, well, you're going to have to learn to like vegetables. And of course, I was just about eating carrots. So it was a bit of a rough start, and I thought I was going to get pretty sick from it, to be honest. And but I just sort of made this decision where we'd been driving along the motorway, and I said to my dad, how come you never see the dead cows or the sheep in the fields? And he said, because we don't wait for them to die, we kill them, otherwise they wouldn't taste very good. And that was it. And that just stayed with me. And from then on, I had that, that problem that I needed to not eat animals, but at the same time, I hadn't really fixed it on the diet front. And it was a few years later, when I was about 16, that I knew enough about things like the dairy industry to say, oh gosh, I'm going to have to go further. I'm going to have to go vegan. But I really didn't want to, in the sense that I didn't like being different to everybody else. I didn't know any other vegans. It was a kind of awkward thing. I made excuses. I did the sort of, I don't really get on with dairy. I think I might be intolerant to it. And then when I moved to Germany, then I really had problems, because I moved to a country where people ate a lot of meat. They really didn't understand where I was coming from. I didn't want to stand out. I don't know how convinced I was of the rightness of being vegan, in the sense that I was aware that I was quite a sensitive person, quite an anxious person. And I thought, is this just my problem? And I'm turning it into, this inability to eat animals when everybody else does. So over the years, I used to rely on eating fish when I had to for a social situation. It feels horrible to say it now, but it felt like I ate the fish for the social reasons, because I was so apologetic if I was putting people out. But I always kind of stuck with the soy milk side of things. But it was years later that I actually came out and said, I'm actually vegan, and all of this other stuff is just kind of white noise. And that got much easier when I became a doctor, and I realised that actually the health benefits are numerous. The climate arguments are there. Why would you not do this? I don't need to apologise to anyone. So I had a real confidence in my sort of coming out at that time.
It's always fascinating to me. I love speaking to doctors about like their sort of medical training and when they've been through sort of a vegan epiphany. And I don't know why. I think, in society, rightly so, we sort of we hold that kind of qualification up to a very high regard. And I think to some extent we sort of think, we grow up as kids thinking doctors know absolutely everything about everything. And so like now in the sort of vegan community, I'm kind of almost like a little shocked when I speak to doctors about like the nutritional training as part of that sort of 7-year course. And I suppose it makes perfect sense. You're learning an awful lot, and then to put in like a really robust medical training in amongst that 7-year course, there's probably just not the time. I don't know. But when you reflect back now and you think about like the importance that you'd put on nutrition now, what you've learned through plant-based health professionals and through all your studies into the kind of nutrition and so on, do you look back and think, actually, if I was redesigning what the sort of the 7-year medical course was, I would 100% put more nutrition in? Or do you think it needs to be a sort of almost a follow on, a kind of like lifelong learning, and nutrition's kind of maybe down the track?
Yeah, so we didn't learn much about nutrition actually in medical school. It wasn't a big part of our education. And to be honest, I don't envy whoever has to design a medical curriculum, because it's huge. There's a lot to cover. And we are in a sort of a society where we're not really looking so much at disease prevention, but we're actually fighting disease. So it's a chronic disease model. So the focus is more on just what we need to treat, how we can treat it safely. And so we're learning about a lot of conditions and diseases. And I think, in the medical curriculum, in the medical school curriculum, things are changing now. So there is more of an emphasis on preventative medicine and lifestyle medicine. And there are now curriculums that do contain, a big chunk based on this, looking at the different pillars of lifestyle medicine, like sleep, exercise, stress management. And so it's really exciting to see that shift happening in medical schools and the education landscape changing from what it was when say, me and Clare were at medical school.
I think it's fair to say as well that when you go to medical school, you're really excited about the curative aspects of things, and the health promotion side of things doesn't seem very sexy or interesting at all. And I remember when I went off to medical school, meeting people who'd been through the process, who were going, having gone through this process, I'm much more interested in, how we actually prevent disease, or in, public health or world health issues. And I remember thinking, oh no, I'm going to become an oncologist, or I'm going to actually do something about these diseases when people have them. And so trying to put into the curriculum things about the fact that we could actually prevent these diseases happening in the first place. And when you think about I always talk about Kim Williams, who's an American cardiologist, who basically says you could get rid of 95% of the cardiologists in America if you did something about diet. If you got everybody on a plant-based diet, we wouldn't be in a job. And that is, that people love removing clots and saving people's lives, and we love raising money for defibrillators and not thinking about what happened in the years before. So I think, there is a little bit of that as well as to, what actually holds people's interest.
Yeah, and I guess like in the US system, and I never think this is the doctors themselves, but I always sort of have some, maybe it's the conspiratorial within me, that there's almost like there's a kind of shadowy relationship between pharmaceuticals, the manufacturers of food, and the not the medical industry at the ground level, but at a higher level in terms of it's a profit-based industry over in the States. And I wonder whether there's those links are kind of not necessarily not being made, but being made in kind of like, well, that's too big a problem to solve. It's much easier to fix it after the fact, and that just so happens to make a lot of money and so on. I don't know if that's just the conspiratorial in me, but that I wouldn't mind getting your perspective on that from what you can see, and I appreciate it's different across the pond to over here.
My only thought is always when you look at the way research works, it's definitely the case that you're going to get the most research put into something where there might be a drug that can be sold at the end of it. And I mean, that's not always a bad thing, because drugs can be good. But if you're sort of like looking at something that's freely available and no one's going to, if it turns out that avocados are the elixir, you can't patent that as a drug. And so there's a question around what research actually takes place. And you rely on publicly funded research to really get into the crux of what's going on with nutrition, I think.
Yeah, no, it's like you say. I think that makes perfect sense. That there's that link there, and often when sort of you find folks who are kind of giving health information on places like Instagram and so on, and they're referring to a study, and then there's a counter argument of, well, who's paid for the study, and it all gets really messy really quickly, which is why I really value the work of yourselves and plant-based health professionals and people like Dr. Alan Desmond, and folks who I feel like have researching sort of robustly, as opposed to the fitness influencer kind of thing. There's so much of that out there. And just before, I've got loads of questions for you about specifics of nutrition, but just because I'm fascinated, how does it sort of feel moving into this world of kind of influencing, I guess, through the podcast and so on, and getting a message out there of health when you are up against those kind of voices who aren't particularly using great research, maybe referencing the carnivore diet and this, that and the other, and it can from a distance to the sort of perhaps the untrained who are flicking through their Instagram feed, it can be difficult to sort out the sort of noise from the signal, if you like. Like, how does that feel, sort of moving into this world as opposed to the sort of the one-on-one conversation with a patient, etc.?
So, Jim, we're actually loving doing this work right now because, you know, we feel really passionate about not just plant-based nutrition, but also explaining the evidence behind that, because there is robust science now. And, you know, we have a lot of nutritional evidence to suggest that a whole food plant-based diet is beneficial for so many aspects of our health. And it's good to be able to give that information to other healthcare professionals. So typically, you know, if you're sat in a consultation, you know, one-to-one with a patient and you're going through lifestyle or their diet, you can impart some knowledge. But I think for me and Claire, it was a case of, well, how can we expand that to a larger group? How can we start to influence some sort of change within the profession? And you know, so the podcast and the work we do with the plant-based health professionals is to help provide nutritional education and advocacy on whole food plant-based diets. And for our fellow vegans, so for sort of non-healthcare professionals as well, who might be interested in this content, we feel it's really important that they hear the up-to-date medical evidence. And that is important because, you know, we really want the next generation vegans to be healthy. And it's great if people are vegan for ethical reasons, but how can they do it in the most healthy and sustainable way, so that the next generation, when we look back on data, for example, if we're collecting evidence, we can say how important a whole food plant-based diet is and what we need to do to make sure that is healthy and sustainable. So yeah, it's been really fun actually doing this work, and we're learning as we go along because we're also interviewing and meeting experts in their field. So we'll have a gastroenterologist, for example. We'll have dietitians who are experts in, say, diabetes and various areas. So it's been really good, just not only for our education, but also to try and promote that sort of education beyond just doctors and to the wider community, I suppose.
I echo everything Daisy said. We're kind of obsessed with the fact that whenever there's a study out that puts vegan diets in any kind of negative way at all, we're always quick to say, well, you know, how were the vegans eating in the 80s? And it might have been better, it might have been worse. And I think, you know, we might come on to ultra processed foods and things, but if you go back and you look at the fact that when I was first vegan, I hadn't, well, the anecdote that I always tell is that I knew there was something about B vitamins, and I was taking brewer's yeast, I think it was, which doesn't even contain B12. But I thought, I know there's something that I need to be doing. And I had a lot of, and actually ultra processed food probably saved me because I ate a lot of processed cereal, which famously has, you know, things like B12 and, vitamin D and things like that added, and calcium. So, you know, it's sort of, when people are in the kind of big health studies now and they're vegan, we want them to be going in and delivering that cholesterol level of 3.5 because they knew what they were doing, and that we'll have this fantastic retrospective, you know, look of what happened from the 2015s onwards when so many people went vegan, and that we'll actually have a massive cohort, because when the studies come out now, it's always the vegans get lumped together with the vegetarians because there just weren't enough vegans, and you get all kinds of conclusions coming up. And we really believe in the whole food plant-based diet, so we know that when you do separate out those things and you do those things properly, you can get great results. We just haven't had the numbers to date of people doing it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. As you mentioned ultra processed, it'd be good to kind of get into that. And sort of cards on the table, 7 years vegan, spoke to lots of wonderful folks, and I'm completely confused. I'm still to a degree. I mean, obviously, like I'm being flippant, but I get like whole food plant-based diet is what I should be looking for. However, like busy lives, etc. I think the way that processed food is kind of talked about in the media, social media, etc. There's a sort of nagging part of me that thinks if I have anything that is processed, then that's, you know, terrible news for me, and I've kind of undone all the good stuff. And then there's this element of like, what's ultra processed versus, I keep hearing lightly processed and things like that now, on again from social media. Perhaps I need to just get off social media and eat some plants, I don't know, but there's an element of confusion there. As much as you can, and I appreciate it is incredibly difficult and complex subject to sort of sum up. What's your kind of view of this discussion right now around these things, around processed, lightly processed, ultra processed, all these kind of words?
Well, I think we'd always start by saying that the problems that have come up recently in literature, and they've come out through lots of diet studies that have been done, and they've been put together, and you've looked at sort of what on average the studies have been saying to get a better quality of evidence. So something called a meta-analysis has been done, and that they have definitely come out and said that there is an association between high intake of ultra-processed foods and things like increased risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, cancer, depression, even with some of them. And, you know, you can't get away from the fact that studies are saying that there's that association. Where you have to unpack it and where it gets really, really difficult is that this is definitely not a problem that focuses more on vegan versus non-vegan food. It is, you know, it's across the board. It's all types of food manufacturing. And then within that, somebody may feel that they don't know what is ultra processed and what is just processed. Well, processing for food is necessary. We don't just go into the woods and find yogurt or baked bread, or other things that we'd find more edible. So we have to do things like pasteurize foods. We bake them, we cook them, we grind them up. And all of those things might be permissible to a certain level and not be bad for human health. It's when you're talking about the fact that there's an association, I think, between foods that contain high amounts of fat, sugar and salt to make them really tasty and addictive. Those types of food are often the same ones that fall into the category of ultra-processed food. I have to go back a bit there and say, look, you know, there's no agreed definition of what an ultra-processed food is. There are loads of classification systems out there. The one that tends to be used is something called the NOVA classification system. And if you look at that system, it just is a system that classifies things by how much has been done to the food and what's been added. It's not a comment on how healthy those foods are. So you might find things in category 4, which is ultra processed, which are essentially good alternatives to unhealthy foods that are found in category 1. So you can't even, you know, you can't hope to understand it without really going into the weeds about what's going on with food processing. And when I sort of say, you know, it's to our mind, because you will find things like red meat, milk in category 1, and something like processed meat would be in category 3. So it's not actually classified as an ultra processed food. These are things that we know. We know that processed meat definitely causes cancer, and we know that red meat has a high association with cancer. So these are the things that you should be avoiding independently of their processing classification.
To lump everything into one category and say this is ultra processed, this is not good for us, is actually oversimplifying it, and it's a lot more nuanced than that. So, for example, as you mentioned with your sandwiches, the supermarket bread, for example, if that's ultra processed food, is not necessarily high in fat, sugar and salt, for example, as say a donut would be. So they're two very different foods, and to put them in one category doesn't make sense in terms of the nutritional component. And I think that's really, really important that people understand that. The NOVA classification wasn't actually meant to be purely for the nutritional contents of food. It was actually based on where foods are made and whether they're made in factories, for example. So these are important considerations and nuances to think about when it comes to processed foods. And also, I'd say in terms of the studies that we do have, there are studies that compare meat say, to a plant-based meat, so plant-based burger to a meat burger, for example, and the plant-based burger still comes up favourably in terms of cardiovascular profile. It's got more fibre, and when you compare like for like, it will still be better for your health than the meat counterpart.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that, actually? So for example, so I think this is where the sort of maybe the confusion in my mind comes about, is things like, so like supermarket bread. I hear lots of bad things about sort of, say, supermarket bread. And then I then think, this is an insight into my lunchtime habits, but then I think about vegan kind of processed meat equivalents. So, you know, there's sort of the slices that would go in a sandwich and so on. And I put all that together and then think, okay, this is a horrible meal for me and I shouldn't be eating it.
Fully ultra processed lunch. Yeah, it is. But, you know, when you unpick that, what we would be saying is, you know, in terms of the fact that food has to be affordable, it has to be nutritious. Something like supermarket bread, even whole grain supermarket bread, which is it uses whole grains, it's got some really good things about it. It will be in category 4 and it will be defined as ultra processed just because it is made on an industrial scale, just because it's not artisan. But that's an affordable option for people and it's not necessarily unhealthy. And coming on to those slices of meat alternative, well, it depends. You can get some really good low fat, low salt, high protein equivalents, which would be a good way of getting protein into your sandwich. And we don't know for sure, just because we've got these studies saying people who eat a lot of ultra processed foods are at increased risk of these diseases. We don't know whether if we picked out someone who just had that meat alternative and didn't have all the other ultra processed foods that are high in fat and salt and sugar, we don't know that their health would suffer. We're not at that level of detail. So you've got to be a little bit open-minded and also bear in mind that it's instead of what? If you are having that meat alternative instead of ham, processed ham, red meat, you're doing your body a favour. So everybody might be on a journey of where they get to in whole food eating.
Yeah. Well, that does sort of comfort me to some extent, because I think there is that narrative that's going on out there, and I do feel like it's really purposefully kind of targeting the vegan element of food that's out there at the moment, and trying to make this direct link between the two. Like, it's a bit of a concerted effort, I think. And again, my sort of conspiratorial part of me has an element of in fact I've been told by folks who are kind of close to the industry that is a pretty concerted effort to use the word ultra processed in association with veganism and compare it to, well, meat is a natural product, and so it's interesting to hear your perspectives from a general standpoint. Even if you are eating the sort of the junk food vegan diet, by comparison, if you were eating the junk food meat and dairy version, there is still a degree better health, but obviously we should be thinking of those things as transitional and journey towards our kind of whole food plant-based ideal. Would that be your kind of perspective?
I think that's our ideal, but we're also very realistic about the fact that if you want a school to adopt a plant-based menu, you have to get these foods in there which children are going to eat. And when they put on, or I don't know, but just having had that feedback from people who are trying to do catering in schools, for example, unless they come up with something that tastes like a chicken nugget or a sausage, it doesn't get eaten. So we are where we are as a society, and particularly. Unfortunately, we always say start with children, but unfortunately, you can't. I think children only develop the kind of the sense of the knowledge and what they should be eating when they're older, and they're able to intellectualize it a bit more. So I think it's great that these alternatives are there, and I think you're absolutely right when you say that. There is this kind of ultra processed food association with veganism. It is just another thing to level at veganism and say, well, how can it be good when you're having to, come up with something that's much more processed than a pork sausage in order to meet your protein requirements. But yeah, what can we say about that?
Yeah. The bit that you mentioned there about children resonates. I've got a 6-year-old in primary school at the moment, and had a small battle at the beginning of his education to get a vegan alternative at all. The school originally said, well, we're too small to do that. Which I was like, well, that can't be a thing. Like, yeah, and they did. To their credit, I think they thought, well, if we just say this, maybe he'll say, oh, well, don't worry about it then. Obviously, I was like, well, no. Almost had to get the protected ethical belief line out, but didn't quite have to get that far. But they did eventually produce something, and he has now a range of options. But largely, those options are kind of fairly processed things. It's like today, for example, was like a roast piece of corn. Essentially, it was like a corn sort of roast equivalent with roast potatoes and vegetables and so on. So I guess that, like you say, they're trying to make it as equivalent to what the other kids are eating anyway, and by degrees, I suppose. I'd still, obviously for varying reasons, rather he was eating that than the sort of the other roast, the meat roast alternative. But yeah, it's interesting, that sort of piece of work, and I think about I'd love to live in the catchment area of I think it's Dale Vince has got a program going on, the owner of Forest Green Rovers, with making school meals and so on, and it'd be great to have that kind of piece rolled out worldwide, but or countrywide, sorry, but hopefully we'll get there with everyone's kind of influence. But yeah, another sort of element that sort of jumps to mind that I'd like to talk about, and again, it's something I'm hearing a lot of discussion and debate over, almost a lot of counter argument, is the plant milks versus dairy milks kind of comparison, and again, the sort of fitness influencers on the sort of opposing side of veganism, leveling things about lots of added seed oil and things like this into plant milks, and that's detrimental to health and so on, as well as all the usual stuff, the calcium and so on. It would be great to get your view, and I know you've done some fab episodes on this kind of discussion in your podcast, In a Nutshell. I thoroughly recommend everyone, if they want the deeper dive, to go into your podcast and take a listen. But it would be great to get your sort of your summary view of plant milks, dairy milks, the pitfalls, maybe even about some of the plant milks. Are there ones we should be watching out for in the sort of vegan community that perhaps there's some ingredients maybe we should avoid, or is it all good? We should just, as long as you're on plant milk, it's all great.
So so this is a really interesting question, Jim, because I think the dairy industry over the years has done such a good job of marketing their product. I think to the point that people don't even know alternative sources of calcium other than milk or dairy. So everyone thinks we need to have milk for our bones, otherwise children won't grow or adults will fracture. But the interesting thing is that studies show that the countries that consume the most dairy actually have got the highest rates of bone fractures. So we certainly do not need dairy to protect our bones. And in fact, I'd go so far as saying you're better off without dairy. And you might ask me, why is that? We know that 70% of the global population have a lactose intolerance. And what that means is after weaning, our body can't process lactose, the sugar in dairy anymore. So we can't break it down. We perhaps lack enough of the enzyme called lactase to break down lactose. And when you have that condition, you will have all sorts of digestive issues, side effects from consuming dairy. So things like bloating, gas, abdominal pain, diarrhea. And it just goes to show that we don't need to drink milk from another species. Most of us cannot process it. In fact, I was lactose intolerant and didn't realise it, just continued to consume dairy. And I think I did continue to consume dairy because, again, society just deems it as normal and necessary, and I thought I needed to, yet it was doing me harm. So the good news, we don't need dairy, and in fact we'd be better off without it. We know that dairy is quite high in saturated fat, which can increase cholesterol levels, and that in turn can lead to cardiovascular disease. And in some people, dairy can be quite inflammatory, so it can cause things like eczema, acne and allergies, and some people find they produce quite a lot of mucus. And what's interesting about dairy is it's high in growth factors, so things like IGF-1, and it would be because it's a substance that's there to grow a calf into a big cow, so it's really high in these growth factors. And IGF-1 has been associated with certain cancers. So the strongest evidence for the link between dairy and cancer is in prostate cancer. But the evidence for female cancers is mixed. We do know that their studies show that if you swap out dairy milk for soya milk, for example, you reduce your risk of breast cancer by over 30%. So it's good news. You don't need to have dairy, and you can get calcium from lots of other plant sources. As I mentioned, most people don't know what those sources are, and I can give a few examples. Things like dark leafy vegetables, especially the low oxalate ones, so broccoli, bok choy, these sorts of vegetables. Nuts and seeds are another good source, particularly sesame seeds and almonds, for example. Lots of the legumes, and one of our favourite is tofu, so soya products. They'll have lots of calcium, and there's a particular brand that me and Clare always go on about called Cauldron, for example, and this is a calcium set tofu, so it's even higher in calcium than sort of normal soya products. And as you mentioned, the dairy replacements, so there are plant-based milks, and these are often fortified with comparable levels of calcium to their dairy counterparts, and they're usually fortified with other things like B12, vitamin D and iodine, so these are good substitutes. Now, you mentioned, are they ultra processed? Is there an issue with them? And I think it's really important to consider the nutritional profile of the final product. So, and what it provides in the context of the whole diet. So a small amount of oil or emulsifier in your plant-based milk is not going to be an issue if you've got a largely whole food plant-based diet, and we know your intake of ultra-processed food is going to be lower on that sort of diet anyway. So it's about looking at the whole diet rather than just an individual component and vilifying that individual component. So the addition of these plant-based milks can be quite nutritious, and they can be quite important for people who are using them as a calcium or a vitamin D source. Now, if some people choose not to add any oils to their diet at all, or they don't want to add any gums or emulsifiers, then there are actually plenty of plant-based milks out there that don't have these additives in them, and they're often the organic ones. So things like Plenish and Rude Health has got an organic variety. So there are plenty of options if people don't want to consume plant-based milks that do have other additives in them. But you just need to be careful because they're not fortified, so they won't have the calcium and vitamin D. You've got to make sure you've got your sources from other plant-based sources if you're going down that route.
Good news for my oat latte addiction.
Definitely.
Yeah, I was like mildly worried. I think maybe being slightly anxious, do sort of absorb some of these things that are said on the sort of counter sometimes, and think, well, look, I'm in this for all the ethical reasons. But is not that I'm thinking dairy's good, but more that I'm thinking, should I not be having oat lattes?
I think you have to think about the fact that any milk that you have is essentially it's a transition food. We've just got a culture that uses milk in drinks and things like that, but you don't have to use it. But when you do, it's like it's perfectly fine. It's like you can just see it as a treat food and have exactly the milk you want. And of course, if you go through the hierarchy of milks, you are going to put soya above oat purely on a nutritional value, but it doesn't mean to say that oat is bad. It's just oat is not where you're going to get your protein from, but that's fine because you're just having it in a coffee.
It makes sense. I'm just going through my health anxieties at the moment. It feels like so I hope you don't mind indulging me. But the next one on my list of things I wanted to talk to you about. It's like the day job. Yeah, I guess so. I guess it is. Yeah. Sorry, it's all right. Can't get away from it.
I love it.
So the next thing that was kind of on my mind is omega-3, and that whole conversation again. relatively confusing for me. Although I listened to your little nugget episode recently.
Oh, great!
And that did help me. It made me think, right, I just need to get some algal oil on the go, and I'll probably be in a much better position. But it'd be good to get into a little bit of that. And I'll caveat that with, on my dinner table this evening was a well-known brand of vegan mayo. And on the packaging, it said, great source of omega-3. And I thought, that's interesting and potentially confusing, because I don't see this as a food that I should be using to get anything from, other than it's just tastes good and it's probably not particularly nutritionally good. So I had a look at the label, and ultimately it was like 73% rapeseed oil was what this thing was made of. So I still came to the conclusion that it wasn't particularly good for me. But I suppose the subset of my question is, there's obviously an element there of a company spotting an opportunity to put something on the front that is, I suppose, technically true, like rapeseed oil with omega-3, etc. But to call it a good source feels like a bit of a stretch. Again, like your advice for vegans, on omega-3s and their comparative with fish, but also with just watching out for the labelling here, because it feels like, I guess, we're in relatively new territory with the kind of like the amount of vegan products that are hitting the market, and there's also a little bit of playing perhaps on the confusion that we might be in as we're sort of learning about this way of eating, if you like, although we might have been in it for a while. I hope that all made sense. That was a lot of words.
Yeah, and obviously people do feel that they need to eat fish. We've got a guideline that tells you to do so, to have 2 portions of fish a week. One of those should be oily. And this is coming from the idea that we need to have these omega-3s in our diet. And we probably do, because they're really important for heart and brain health and nerve health. But it's just, is it healthy to eat fish? It's always instead of what. So it can be healthy to swap a portion of red meat or pork for a portion of fish, but obviously we're advocating plant-based, so we're always going to talk about how you can get those omega-3s through a plant source. It's like any food you pick up, you might be able to say, there are certain criteria, so you can't actually call something a good source of protein, for example, unless it's 12% of the calories come from protein or something. But for other sources of things, there's maybe not the same criteria. So it's absolutely true. If you're talking about the plant-based omega-3s, so the ones that we get mostly from plants, not from the very specific plant, the algae, then that is something called the ALAs, which are the short chain omega-3s. And yes, you find a lot of them in rapeseed oil. So it is true that it's a good source. Flaxseed oil is also a good source, flax seeds, chia seeds. And so we do encourage those as part of a whole food diet. The problem with rapeseed oil, where you get lost in it, is that rapeseed oil has also got a lot of omega-6s in. And when it comes to omega-3s and why we dwell on fish as a source of the longer chain omega-3s, the EPA and the DHA, why we dwell on fish is because sort of, if you look at how we make those long chain omega-3s in the body, we can make them, but we need an enzyme for converting that. And that's the same enzyme that the omega-6s that are found in rapeseed oil sort of mop up as well. So there's this theory that if you have too many omega-6s in your diet, within the same food, you've got omega-3s and omega-6s, but if you've got too many omega-6s overall, you're not going to be able to convert the short chain omega-3s into the longer chain ones, and then you're going to be short, which is why fish is then, you're able to promote fish as a superfood, because those long chains omega-3s, they come ready-made, and so fish contains the EHA and the DPA. The only way you're going to get that directly in your diet as a vegan is to take the microalgae supplement, which is obviously what ends up in the fish's body and why they've got such a high level of them. But if you get it from source, you can do that as a vegan. There's lots of, there's lots of disagreement really about who actually needs to take an omega-3, a long-chain omega-3 supplement. It's one of those things where we just exercise caution. So we focus on the vulnerable groups. So we say like pregnant women, perhaps children, perhaps if you're elderly. And that's all to do with the fact that your rate of converting the short chain omega-3s that you find in your flaxseed and your walnuts and your rapeseed, your rate of converting them may not be good enough if you're pregnant, because you've got a higher demand for the growing fetus and everything. Or as you get older, all things in our digestive system seem to slow down. And so there's often this case that, you even people who eat meat and fish and everything, they end up having to take a B12 supplement as they get older because they're not able to absorb it as well. We think it's sort of the same with what the body does with things like omega-3s.
Thank you so much for this therapy session. You've both helped me wonderfully, honestly. And as does the podcast as well, I must say. Like, In a Nutshell is a fantastic sort of source of information for folks who may be feeling a little bit like me and are treading the difficult waters of social media. And naturally, if you post anything vegan, then you're going to get the anti-view because the algorithm wants you to be riled up. So so you're going to see lots of those kind of things. So yeah, I'd recommend everyone get off social media and go and listen to your podcast. It's fantastic. It's a great resource. And there's loads of wonderful episodes. And you've had some great people on there too. Dr. Alan Desmond, who we mentioned earlier, Shireen Kazam, just some wonderful folks in there. So thoroughly recommend folks go and find it. So search, I don't need to ask you where to find that folks can find that if they've found this podcast. Search on your podcast provider of choice and you can find it In a Nutshell. Is there anywhere else we need to tell folks to go and head to?
Yeah, no, Jim, thank you so much for mentioning the podcast and for listening to the episodes as well. So if people are interested, I'd recommend that they go onto our website, so the Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. We've got a lot of information on the website, including fact sheets on like various different medical conditions. So if someone has pre-diabetes or high blood pressure, I'm forever giving out the cholesterol one actually in practice because everyone's got sort of borderline cholesterol, and I'm asking people to switch more to a plant-based diet, and it gives you ideas for how to make those swaps, what sort of foods to take out and what sort of foods to include more of. So there's really excellent fact sheets on there. There's also a 21-day challenge on there. So for people that are new to plant-based eating, we'll take them through supportive, 21 days and various recipes. And yeah, lots of information on our website. And obviously, if people prefer to listen to their information, then we've also now got the podcast. But yeah, have a look on our website.
Plant-based data, yeah. So plantbaseddata.org, we haven't released the episode yet, but we spoke to a doctor in Canada called Tusha Mehta, and he set up much more focused on sustainable diet. So if you are interested in whether it's kind of right and sustainable to eat fish and what the environmental implications are, which we haven't, quite deliberately, I haven't touched on those today, but he's got fantastic papers on there, and he works with another man who's a sort of environmental sustainability scientist, and so the quality of that information is just fantastic. You can find the latest stuff on whatever you want to know about in terms of sustainable diets there.
Awesome. Well, I'll pop links to that in the show notes, and obviously links to In a Nutshell and plant-based health professionals, etc. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and thank you so much for indulging all of my health anxieties. I will rest assured of your wonderful advice. Thanks so much.
Well, I was just going to say, if it's your health anxiety that's made you go plant-based, that's fantastic, and long may health anxiety reign in the UK.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It was really great chatting with you.
This is a Bloody Vegans production.